To be honest, I'm not going to criticize anyone. Russia once again was not ready for war. There was an underestimation of the enemy and an overestimation of their troops.
Russia lost the war in Ukraine long before it was lost on the battlefield. It lost internally even before the first shot was fired. Putin and his commanders assumed that the Ukrainian people would welcome them as liberators and that Kiev would fall within a few days. But that was not the outcome. However, Russia had already lost in Ukraine before it even began. It was doomed to failure from day one, because the Kremlin's victory plan was based not on a strategy, but on a massive lie. Even before the war began, the embodiment of the Russian army, retired General Leonid Ivashov, saw this, and he called for Putin's resignation. Dozens of city council members in major cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg also saw this and called for the Russian leader to resign. The peaceful sky that Stalingrad veteran Pavel Petrovich Vinokurov dreamed of is now riddled with Ukrainian missiles. Faced with this picture, even the most loyal are no longer silent.
We received a serious, cruel lesson, and I would give an unsatisfactory assessment to our intelligence community of Russia.
These words were confessions from Vladimir Chirkin, former commander of the ground forces and one of Russia's most experienced military figures. He challenged Putin's optimistic expectations regarding the war in Ukraine.
In fact, the case was expressed by the leadership of the country. I would say false information that 70% of Ukraine population are of us and 30% are against. It turned out exactly the opposite. 30 for us and 70 against.
The retired Colonel General exposed the fundamental fatal flaws in Russia's military strategy one by one. He stated that Russia was caught unprepared for the war, just as it had been in wars in past centuries. At the heart of Chirkin's criticism lies the failure of the Russian intelligence services, particularly the FSB. According to Chirkin, the Russian army had fallen victim to the Tbilisi syndrome. That is, intoxicated by the easy victory in the 2008 Georgia war, they believed they could take Ukraine in 3 days. Look at this image. While fairy tales of everything going according to plan were being told in the Kremlin's gilded halls, this was the reality on the ground.
Look at me. I feel bad. I don't have a hand there. For example, you have another hand, let's say. There is no leg, but you have another leg.
Young children are losing their legs, arms, and futures for the sake of those generals' lies. And it's not just the front lines. Russia's interior is also burning. Tourists fleeing the beaches of Crimea. Streets plunged into darkness in Moscow. Refineries are ablaze. Water is cut off. Belgorod and Kursk have been occupied, and there are over 1 million casualties. And Chirkin is not the only one speaking openly. This is General Leonid Ivashov. He is not a liberal dissident, he is the system itself. A true Russian nationalist, a patriot. And this man dismantled Putin's June 2024 thousand-year empire narrative with a single statement. A single bitter diagnosis. Strategic defeat. In fact, this diagnosis was like a lesson from an experienced Russian general, telling Putin where to retreat. It was perhaps a veiled second call for resignation. And this man had made a statement weeks before the invasion even began, calling on Putin to resign. So why would a hawk like Ivashov, who is part of the system, now throw his commander-in-chief's legacy into the fire? Because Ivashov saw the brutal truth that Putin refuses to see, the truth that the propaganda machine tries to hide. Now, this is going to be a controversial topic, and I don't care if YouTube doesn't promote it. I'm going to expose the truth anyways. Controversial topics like this one end up getting suppressed by the algorithm, except when you force the algorithm to promote it by clicking on the like button. Thank you. That truth is that the Russian army is no longer an army, but a structure that is eating itself from within. A rotten structure. And another truth Ivashov saw was General Valery Gerasimov's lie. The chief of the Russian General Staff lied to Vladimir Putin himself, openly and provably, about the Pokrovsk front in order to save his seat. While Putin paints a portrait of a professional, patriotic and heroic army on state television, Former staff officers like Ivashov see how this army is experiencing a disaster of discipline from within, how it is morally bankrupt. The first sign of this bankruptcy is the complete collapse of authority. These images are not Ukrainian propaganda. This is evidence leaked by Russian sources themselves of what happened to a soldier from Russia's 25th Combined Arms Army, 67th Division, 36th Regiment. This soldier refused to participate in a senseless meat grinder operation. He became a refusenik. So, what did his own commanders do to him? They chained him to a tree for 3 days, leaving him hungry and thirsty. Let's pause and analyze. This is not a disciplinary investigation. This is a crime committed by an army against its own soldier. This is a snapshot of a structure where authority has completely collapsed, where commanders see torture as the only way to enforce discipline. The vertical hierarchy established by Putin has turned into complete chaos on the front lines. The authority vacuum is so great that feudal structures such as the Akhmat special unit affiliated with Kadyrov are bullying regular Russian army soldiers. There are reports of Russians harassing Russians. The army has turned into a feudal structure where soldiers fight each other, steal each other's supplies, and where ruthlessness, not merit, is rewarded. Is the Russian people sending their sons to Ukraine to die, or to be tied to trees by their own commanders? This is the nightmare Ivashov sees. Things are turning upside down in Russia. Political and social fractures have reached an unprecedented level. The cause of this fracture is not only the bad news coming from the front lines. The real turning point is that the cost of the war has begun to directly affect every Russian citizen's pocket, table, and future. The high cost of living, fuel crises, huge gas queues, and collapsing public services have exhausted the patience of the people. As this social patience reached breaking point, silence began to give way to loud criticism. Some Russian journalists working for state media are now issuing warnings directly targeting Putin and his regime. Dmitry Shechin, editor of the Komsomolskaya Pravda newspaper, was a loyal supporter of Putin at the beginning of the war. But today, the same man is openly saying that if the problems faced by the people are not solved, it could lead to the collapse of the regime and the end of Putin. Dozens of city council members in major cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg are calling for the Russian leader to resign. The most symbolic and daring act of this wave of courageous rebellion came from the Smolenskoye District Council in St. Petersburg. This local council went far beyond a simple call for resignation, breaking Russia's biggest taboo. The council members submitted an official request to the State Duma, Russia's parliament, demanding that Vladimir Putin be removed from office on charges of treason due to the war in Ukraine. This was a step equivalent to political suicide. To label a war that Putin called a special military operation and presented as a sacred patriotic duty as treason against the country meant declaring direct war on the regime's entire propaganda apparatus and legal coercion mechanism. However, these council members had constructed their arguments in an extremely careful and legalistic manner based on the regime's own constitution and laws. In their petition, they summarized how Putin's actions harmed Russia in 4 key points. These key points were the destruction of the army, demographic catastrophe, economic collapse, and strategic defeat. Of course, these Duma members did not harbor any illusions that the State Duma would process this petition and put Putin on trial. Their goal was different. Their goal was to light a torch, and they achieved it. These calls are not limited to liberal centers, but are spreading to regions that have paid the heaviest price for the war and are economically oppressed. Because living in Russia has now become, in the truest sense of the word, a battle for survival. Analyses by independent polling companies and reputable institutions, such as the Journal of Democracy, reveal the depth of this change. 57% of the population now say they support peace talks. The percentage of those who want the war to continue has fallen to 35%. In other words, it was understood that there would be no peace in Russia while Putin was in power. Another point these results indicate is that Putin must now leave, step down from his position, because the international sanctions now in place, rising inflation, and the increasing cost of the war at the front have placed an unbearable burden on ordinary citizens. Basic products such as oil, milk, and pasta are either very expensive or completely sold out on supermarket shelves. It has become difficult to find many medicines in pharmacies. However, perhaps the most striking area of crisis has been the fuel shortage. Not only driving a car, but also heating, transportation, and even sending children to school has become impossible. Gasoline has been unavailable in the Nizhny Novgorod region for about 3 weeks. According to local sources, even school buses are unable to operate in the Perevozky district. Transportation companies unable to find fuel have been forced to leave hundreds of school-age children at home. This situation has disrupted not only transportation, but also the fundamental right to education. The picture in Crimea is no different. On the peninsula, with a population of over 2 million, 50% of gas stations are completely empty. The zero on the station signs indicates that there is literally no fuel left. Moreover, this situation is not unique to Crimea. Across Russia, 2.6% of all gas stations have run out of fuel. At first glance, 2.6% may seem like a low percentage. However, the key point to note is that this figure is rapidly increasing every day. The collapse in fuel supply is not regional. It is a systemic crisis. Even in some regions where fuel is available, it is allocated only to state institutions. This means that all civilian use, except for ambulances, security units, or official vehicles, has been postponed. Citizens, despite waiting for hours in front of stations with jerry cans in their hands, are often forced to return home without fuel. And in places where gasoline can be found, prices have climbed to 80 rubles, which is an exorbitant amount for the large masses living on the minimum wage. Driving a car is no longer a luxury, it is almost impossible. On the other side of this tragic equation are the babushkas, millions of elderly Russians who have served this state throughout their lives and endured hardships are now being betrayed by their own government. The process that began with the 2018 pension reform and continued with the raising of the retirement age to 65 for men and 60 for women fundamentally shook this generation's trust in the state. The brutal cost of the war has deepened this crisis. To close the 2025 budget deficit, the Kremlin withdrew 4.8 billion euros from the Social Assistance Fund and transferred it directly to war expenditures. This meant seizing the savings and social security of millions of pensioners. Real pension payments fell by more than 15%, and worse still, reports began to emerge of weeks-long delays in the payment of pensions in remote parts of the country. Elderly people, accustomed to a regular income throughout their lives and trusting in the state, suddenly faced the risk of hunger and destitution. But this was not the only thing the Kremlin stole from its people's future. As the coffers emptied and the cost of the war increased day by day, the regime now set its sights on the people's present, on every purchase they made, on every bite of food on their table. This was the final and most ruthless act of betrayal. As part of the new 3-year budget plan, the Russian Ministry of Finance officially proposed raising the value-added tax, the country's most fundamental tax, from 20% to 22%. This may appear to be a technical tax adjustment, but in reality, it means placing the burden of the war's costs directly and most ruthlessly on the shoulders of all 140 million Russian citizens. As Alexander Shokin, president of the Russian Union of Industrialists and Entrepreneurs, previously warned, the VAT increase is the most unpleasant tax innovation for the business community and the public. This is because VAT is added to everything you buy, regardless of whether you are rich or poor. This tax hike hits the poorest segments of society and retirees the hardest, as they are forced to spend a large portion of their income on basic necessities. This is the state's attempt to finance the war by further shrinking the morsel in the throats of its most vulnerable citizens. So what is the reason behind this cruel step? The answer was given in all its nakedness by Dmitry Medvedev, deputy chairman of the Security Council, one of the regime's most hawkish figures. Medvedev explicitly characterized the 2026 budget as a wartime budget. This is an admission. It is the most official declaration that every extra ruble collected from the people will not go to hospitals, schools, or repairing burst heating pipes, but directly to sending more missiles, more tanks, and more bullets to the front lines. The state has found no other way to close the massive gap in the pension system and patch the budget hole created by the war than to impose new taxes that will further increase the burden on the people. Life is not easy for Russian youth either. The young people, who are Russia's future, do not see this war as their own. 81% strongly oppose a new mobilization, and this resistance is not just lip service. After the first wave of mobilization in 2022, more than 700,000 young Russians fled the country and sought refuge in neighboring countries. However, the war's insatiable appetite has pushed the Kremlin to find new manpower through even more insidious and ruthless means. Since an official mobilization announcement could trigger mass protests, the regime is conducting a secret second wave of mobilization. This is a manhunt carried out under the guise of volunteering, but in reality based on deception and coercion. Convicts, debtors, and poor young people are made to sign contracts with promises of high salaries and freedom. The aim is to fill the horrific losses on the front lines. However, this not only lowers the quality of the army, it also fundamentally destroys the younger generation's trust in the state. On the battlefield, Russia's casualty toll has reached a horrific level. According to estimates from various sources, the number of dead and wounded Russian soldiers has exceeded 1 million. This alone is a military disaster, and these losses can never be compensated for by the new soldiers arriving through the secret mobilization at the front. Because these new soldiers are untrained, equipped with old and neglected equipment, and more importantly, they are people whose morale is completely broken, who do not understand why they are fighting. The family's perspective on the mobilization is torn apart in the midst of this double betrayal. Soldiers' mothers had been the regime's main supporters for years, believing Putin to be the leader who brought stability. But now, their sons are not returning from the front, their pensions are not being paid, and the state is only lying to them. As documented by Medusa, the helplessness of a soldier's mother, who was detained by 11 police officers for holding a banner that simply stated her son's mobilization date, is the most symbolic image of this mass betrayal. These mothers are no longer the pillars of Putin's power. They are the strongest voices of the silent rebellion that has begun against him. This intergenerational betrayal is creating new and more dangerous dynamics in every corner of Russia. Local protests are no longer just about the political demands of a few activists, but are spreading around the most basic survival issues: unpaid pensions, collapsing heating systems, drug shortages, and children lost in the war. In small and medium-sized cities outside Moscow and St. Petersburg, these bread-and-water protests pose a much greater threat to the regime than political protests. This internal instability inevitably threatens Russia's federal structure. Regions are becoming increasingly reluctant to carry out orders from the central government. Local governors and mayors are caught between Moscow's pressure and public anger. As the cost of the war increases, new taxes introduced by the Kremlin to cover the shortfall in the pension system will further increase the burden on the people, multiplying the intensity and spread of these protests. At the same time, there is a risk of a new wave of emigration from the country. Thousands of people who couldn't escape the first wave of mobilization or who thought a second wave wouldn't start are now looking for new ways to leave the country under increasingly heavy economic and social pressure. This means Russia stands to lose not only its current soldiers, but also its future workforce, intellectual capital, and demographic structure. So once the bleeding has started, can Vladimir Putin really put an end to this trend? Does he still have the cards to silence the people's uprising and the whispers of the elite? Or is Russia being dragged uncontrollably towards one of the dark and chaotic pages of its own history? Putin is trapped in a vicious cycle of his own making. So does this mean Russia is headed for total collapse? If by collapse we mean a 1917-style revolution where the people storm the Kremlin next week, that seems unlikely in the near term. However, if collapse means a state becoming unable to perform its most basic functions, severing its ties with its people, and slowly becoming paralyzed by its own internal contradictions, then the answer is a definite yes. Russia is already in a process of slow-motion collapse. The question now is no longer whether Russia will collapse, but what will trigger this collapse and how it will unfold. Will it be a major military defeat on the battlefield? A total infrastructure disaster in the middle of winter that will affect millions of people? What are your thoughts on this matter? Please share your opinions in the comments. Thank you for watching.